Hello, welcome to Book Joy. Today, let's talk War and Peace. If you're new to the channel, I'm Jack. If you're not new, welcome back to Spread Book Joy. And if you're not new, you may know that I started reading this huge tome back in November as part of a read-along hosted over on Instagram by Anna, whose lovely page, Anna the Books I Read, is wonderful. And she read War and Peace for the first time last year and then decided to do a reread of it and said it's one of the best books ever. There's a lot of love for War and Peace over on Instagram. Lots of people who claim that it's a life-changing book and just talk about it in really quite hallowed ways, which makes it feel a little bit intimidating actually, but also something that I think I've always wanted to read some Tolstoy. I've always been interested in War and Peace. I've thought it was one of those things that one day I will pick up and read. So this just seemed like a perfect opportunity to do so, guided along by someone who has been on that journey before. So that was in November. It was a 10-week journey through War and Peace. I myself am still on that journey. So I was quite ill in December, so my reading plans all went awry. I decided not to rush myself through this journey. I wanted to take it at my own pace and not feel pressure. And I also didn't want this to be the only thing I was reading. So I've now read the first 2 volumes of War and Peace. I'm halfway through the text, and I thought it's about time to give my thoughts on it. So my notes and tips for anyone who wants to read War and Peace starting it, and my credibility for that is I am someone who knew nothing about it, who knew very little. I've never read Russian literature. I know very little about Tolstoy. I know very scant information about Russian history and the Napoleonic Wars. I know just like bare bones in my head about any of this. So I went in pretty much as a complete newbie. So that's my complete lack of credibility for anyone thinking of approaching this and thinking, I can't do this. If I can do it, you can do it. That's my first bit of encouragement for you. But is it worth it? So let's get into that. So first up, a bit of a chat about translations. So I've got a couple here. This one, the Oxford World Classics, an old edition, I've had on my shelf for about 20 odd years, and I just never read. I have a collection of these books that I got for free when I was a bookseller because they changed the covers and we got to take a load of the old ones home for free. So I've got War and Peace, I've had it on my bookshelves for some time, and then when we were doing the read along and there was sort of a big suggestion coming up about, there was a Discord server and there was loads of suggestions about which translation matters. If you've read any translated fiction, you'll know translation does really matter. So the one that got pushed around a lot and said was really readable is the Penguin Classics version translated by Anthony Briggs. So I got this version, and I also in the UK, you can get this on Audible as well. So I like to have a book in multiple formats so that if I'm trying to keep up with a read along particularly, I might not have time to sit down and physically read, but I can listen to it as well. And the Audible is really good. It's excellent. There's a few different narrators, and I've really enjoyed the parts that I have had to listen to. I have enjoyed them. But because War and Peace is something that I wanted to read with a bit more intention and depth, I also decided to annotate War and Peace. Just go back to translations as well, by the way. War and Peace originally had a ton of French in it because at that time the language of the Russian aristocracy, who are the main characters in this book, they spoke French. The elite spoke French. They didn't speak Russian. I read something really interesting over on Bookstagram, and anyone who knows anything about Russian literature can help fill in the comments here. But from what I've been told, the prevalence of French in the Russian courts and the Russian sort of upper classes, and they were the literate people as well, meant that Russian as a written form of language was dying out. And it was one of the classic Russian authors, don't know which one, I feel like I want to say Dostoevsky, but I don't know, one of the classic Russian authors in the 19th century who is credited with keeping the Russian language alive because they insisted on writing in Russian. So War and Peace, the original, there were a lot of passages which are actually in French because that's the language that they spoke, which is really, I found really interesting, and it's referred to a lot in the book. Characters who are at a party or a soiree, they'll be speaking in French quite a lot of the time. When they want to say something with a bit more nuance, they'll speak in French rather than Russian, which I found really fascinating. So in terms of annotating and note-taking, because this is such a big book, it's a huge book with a lot of events and a lot of characters, I wanted to make sure that I fully understood it and immersed myself in it. I started doing some annotating last year for the first time ever, and I found it extremely useful, and it also made me really engage with the text that I read. So I decided I was going to annotate War and Peace, and I'm really glad I did that because it's a huge book, and I've been reading it for quite a long time now, and it also means that I can now take a break from it because I've got a lot of notes to refer to. But warning for that, if you spend all your time annotating and taking notes, you are going to take a long time to read this book, because in the beginning I was taking absolute tons of notes and underlining. I was doing lots and lots of it. I mean, you can't probably see it from here. I'll show you a cutaway or some B-roll footage of my annotations. But I started off by really paying attention, really underlining and colour coding it and annotating it. But it was taking forever. It meant that it was taking me absolute age to read a few pages, and I don't want to read this for the rest of my life. So I've kind of cut back on the amount of annotating I was doing and trying to just let the story flow over me, which is also a really valid way of reading it. And I would also advise you, if you want to start reading War and Peace and you think you might need to take some notes, maybe keep a note of the characters, because those things are confusing in the beginning. Aside from that, the storyline does flow really well. The book, in terms of readability, which is what I'm going to move on to next, amazingly readable. This translation particularly so. I didn't expect this to read like a modern novel, but it reads as a really modern novel. And it's just the way the translation flows, the language that Tolstoy uses, to his descriptive language, the way he talks about characters, I find this a really modern book. It feels very modern when you read it. There are hundreds and hundreds of characters in this book. It is a political sweeping epic. There are several families who are prominent in the book, and as the story goes on, particular characters emerge as the main characters, but in the beginning you've no idea who these people are, so every possible character could be important. And then later on in the story, some characters who seemed to be prevalent in the beginning and dropped off then come back into the story. So one thing I would say, which might be really useful, is to keep a note of characters. There is, in the back of this translation, a list of the characters, but I've been steering away from it, and I'll tell you why. I've been steering away from it because there may be spoilers in there, because it will say who is married to who. And I think I spotted one where it's like, these characters aren't married. Oh, there's a spoiler right there. So if you go and download a cast of characters you can download them from online. You can have a look in if you've got this particular edition, but I'd just be wary of it because it may give you spoilers, and if you really don't want any spoilers, then I'd keep away from that and keep your own notes on characters. The other issue with characters is they change the names. There are lots of different names for the same character, so you'll be talking about a character and then they'll have their more intimate like family name that they're called or something like that, and you'll be like, who is that? Oh, it's that character. So that's just something else to be aware of. So what is War and Peace about? What is the structure of War and Peace? It is, this edition is 1,358 pages of the actual text. There are notes, there's an introduction, there's some other things in here as well, but the actual text is 1,358 pages. It is split into 4 volumes plus an epilogue. I have read the first 2 volumes and am just over halfway through the entire text. So the first 2 volumes are quite possibly the chunkiest, but they're setting up a huge, rich world, a very historic background. So War and Peace tells the tale of several main characters throughout the book and several prominent Russian families who are It starts off at the eve of a party. The very first scene is a party where quite a lot of the main players who are going to emerge as the main characters are introduced to us. But at that time, we don't know who's going to be a main character, what they're doing there, who's going to emerge as someone that we need to be invested in and follow. And there are several side characters who are also at this event, and that's the opening of it. That is in 1805, and in 1805 Napoleon has been making war in the continent of Europe and against the English, and he is threatening Russia seems to be about to go to war with Napoleon at that time. And still to this day, if you've got a country where there's a royal family like we have, nobility are held to be as something separate, and someone like Napoleon, who's not born into that, is seen by the aristocracy as someone who is an upstart with pretensions. So the very first opening is this scene setting, and it's a brilliant way to introduce a book. I love a party or an event to introduce multiple characters, and it kind of sets the tone for the political and social issues of the time as well, which are being discussed at the party. But the book is separated into various sections. There are sections where it is the peace parts, which are set in society at various houses and events and parties. And then there are the war sections, which are, as it said, they're the descriptions of the wars with Napoleon and the campaigns that Russia had against Napoleon's forces. And those parts are actually quite campaign heavy. They're quite detailed on the movements of the army, the historical facts and figures. There are some historical figures of the time: the emperor, the Tsar, and Napoleon himself. They all make appearances throughout the book, and Napoleon and Tolstoy uses them as characters within the book for certain scenes. They're not prominent characters, although their presence is felt throughout the book. So aside from the obvious themes of war and peace, one of the first things I noticed, and I love a novel like this, is the amount of political intrigue and power being wielded about in this book. Everyone in the book, every single person, before they go into a conversation, is thinking what they can get out of that conversation by talking to a particular person. So the themes of power and influence, of what each character can get for themselves, is really prominent in the book, as everyone there wants something from someone else. So here's a quick quote about the different societal standards. And as these very rich aristocrats move from Moscow to St. Petersburg and around, and from the country to the city and back and forth and here, there and everywhere, you can see the difference in their societal standing depending on where they are. Although in Moscow the Rostovs were high society people, without ever realising it, because their social standing could be taken for granted, in Petersburg their position was delicate and uncertain. In Petersburg they were provincials, too lowly for some people who had been their dinner guests in Moscow and had never wondered then what level of society that they belonged to. There is a really interesting character in the book who gets to the top of the pile in terms of power, wealth and influence, but he's not happy and he doesn't want to be there. And that's the next thing that I found really interesting about War and Peace, and I found quite, for a novel that was written in the 19th century, I found it's got a viewpoint of mental health, and there are several characters in it who do struggle with their mental health. One of them is someone who has ended up with wealth and power and influence and is absolutely miserable, and is continually trying to seek out reasons for his life, a purpose for living beyond, because he has money, he has wealth, he has influence, he's got all these things which just ended up with him. He didn't start out with them, but he's ended up with them, and he is miserable. On top of that, there is another character who goes through some grief, who is also equally disillusioned with life after being at war. So the war scenes themselves are really, some of them absolutely horrific, and the conditions that the Russian army found themselves in fighting against Napoleon, they were under-equipped, they were mismanaged, they were at the mercy of aristocratic generals and people who were fighting amongst themselves and couldn't decide on the finer points of the campaign, and ended up being a lot of lives lost because it was so badly managed. And you get Tolstoy's voice coming through really clearly in the book about how awful this campaign was and how atrocious the conditions were for the Russian soldiers at the time. And there are characters in the book, main characters, who have terrible experiences during the first campaign, and they come back and they are changed because of it. One of them in particular is completely changed and goes through quite a period of what we would now say is PTSD and trauma, and like they're also quite depressed. So there are some representations of mental health in this book that I found really, really fascinating. Conditions that we would recognise today and we would have names for. The other parts of it, the other themes, there is a lot about free will and fate and whether we are fated for things to happen to us. And actually there's a section where I said Tolstoy at certain points talks directly. You can hear his voice. He's talking directly and giving his opinion about what's going on in certain situations. And he clearly is a bit of a fatalist, a huge fatalist, at one point talking about the fact that all of the things that happened were not the fault of Napoleon or the fault of the emperor. His history led us all up to a point, and that is why it was inescapable what happened, which really fatalistic kind of attitude. But there are themes with certain characters questioning whether they have chosen what their path is in, what's happened to them, whether they have any free will, whether things are fate. There are questions about life and death. There's some very deep thinking that goes on in War and Peace. Another thing is people's perspectives and what is truth, and truth being subjective and being, truth being everyone's got their own truth as they see it rather than an objective truth. I found that really, really interesting. Class, of course, is quite prominent. These are very, very wealthy, aristocratic characters. There are very few characters who are not of that class. However, when we see them in the army or the servants, or the way that Russian peasants are treated, they are serfs, which means that it's like a medieval serfdom. The aristocrats own all the land and the serfs work the land. They own them in a sense. In one scene, which was really quite shocking, there's a hunting scene and two people are arguing over who's got the best hunting dog, and one of them says, well, he gave up 3 peasant villages for that dog. So it just shows you sort of the value placed on human life, the societal roles in Russia at that time. If you were a peasant, if you were one of the lower classes, the working classes, your life was worth literally nothing in comparison. It's quite stark when you do come across moments like that. That really slapped me in the face when I read that part about how much he'd paid for this hunting dog, and it was villages of people he's given up for this one hunting dog. But class in Russia, as we know, was a huge issue. They ended up having a huge revolution over it. It's not the only country in the world to be like that, but it just really drives home the difference. There are some characters who are aristocrats who have fallen on hard times, as we say, but they're not hard times really. They just don't have enough money to maintain a household of their own. And these characters are really fascinating because they are really clever and seek out the powerful people to help get themselves promoted and get jobs and get roles closer and closer to the emperor, so that they can then wield the influence, they can then have the power and the money. And it's really interesting because the characters there's a conversation between two characters, one of whom is a very spoilt rich young man, the other is a aristocratic young man, but his family obviously don't have as much money and he has to work his way up through the ranks. One of them's kind of, the one who's spoilt is looking down on the other one for always constantly seeking out new positions in employment. It's like, actually, that's privilege right there, to think that to look down on someone for seeking out to better themselves or to better their situation. One thing I really don't like is Tolstoy's attitude towards older women and girls. There are quite a few passages. I mean, he's clearly enamoured of youth and beauty because he discusses and beautifully written passages about some of the younger people and how how physically attractive they are or how, beautiful they are. But when it comes to middle-aged or older women, even women who are just into their 20s who've just been married, Tolstoy is actually quite scathing about older women. Really negative talk. And whilst I recognise there is, I'm usually able to separate my modern sensibilities when I'm reading classics, but in this occasion, I don't like it. I don't like the way Tolstoy talks about older women. There, I've said it. For all her age and plainness, she had been undergoing the same thing as the Rostovs, so being primped and preened and getting ready. But without all the fluster, because it was all a matter of routine to her. Her ageing and unattractive body had been subjected to a similar process of scrubbing and scenting and powdering. Yeah, there are constant references to older women being ugly or elderly or... Yeah, I just didn't like the way he spoke about older women or women who are ageing. There are quite a lot of sections where Tolstoy kind of lectures about his opinion about what happened, what went wrong, what was going on. There are entire sections of war and campaigning that, quite frankly, I'm not really that interested in, and it's probably going to be the silliest statement you'll hear on BookTube, but I am going to say it. I didn't realise there'd be quite so much war in War and Peace. There, I've said it. What I mean is the level of depth that the war scenes and the length of time the campaigns go on for, I'm not that interested in them. There are things that I am interested in. There are certain scenes which are really thrilling. And what I really was fascinated by was, I was surprised about the sort of honest depiction of battle and the horrors of war in a book quite this old. Usually you think of, at the time, war might have been something that was quite glorified, but definitely not in this. The chaos of the Russian campaign and the horrors that these poor soldiers had to go through and the senseless waste of life, it's all there, and it's very raw. But there are sections. There was a whole section on hunting which I talked about previously. I didn't need to read about that. I wasn't bothered about it. I didn't learn anything more from it, about the characters, about the plot. The action didn't advance anymore. And so there are some sections I'm reading, I'm just like, move on. But for all of those parts, and which they are minor, the parts that I'm enjoying very much. And I've had to take a break from it because I've got to a point where I was reading a couple of pages a day at the most because I had so many other things going on, and it does deserve your time and it does deserve your attention. If you want to read it, read it. Think about those things though. Think about the fact that you are going to have to devote some time to it. You're going to have to think about translation, think about whether you have the time to devote to reading it and thinking about it, and whether you might be someone who will be reading one book at a time and that's the only thing you do. But if, like me, you read multiple books at any one time, then you need to devote a bit more time to War and Peace. Not because it's a hard read, because I don't find it mentally taxing in that it's not easy to understand. It's well written, it's readable, it's got a great plot, but it's so vast, it's so big, it's keeping all of that in your mind. And there are some sections in it where I just had to stop and reread them. One for the beauty, and then there are sections I had to stop and reread them because the ideas in it just made me go, whoa, yeah, that's a lot. So at the end of all this, my clickbaity title, is War and Peace worth it? Well, I definitely think so. I think it's worth it if you're someone who has always been curious about reading it and you're ready to put the time and devotion into it that it deserves. I thought I had the time. I haven't had as much time as I wanted to, so I'm recognising that and I'm putting it to one side and leaving it until I feel ready and able to devote more time to the next section. If you've got a passing interest in Russian history, you'll love it. If you if you don't like long scenes of war and campaigning, maybe give it a miss, because there is a lot in here about that. Now, like I said earlier, probably the silliest thing in the world to say there's a lot of war in War and Peace. There is a lot of war in War and Peace, and I'm not necessarily here for that, but I do love the other parts of it. I do appreciate the craft of the novel. I don't think I'll ever read it again, and that sounds like an obvious thing to say, but so many people love this novel so much and they read it again and again, and they hold it up as a life-changing book. It's not a life-changing book for me. It's a book that I'm pleased to have read and experienced. I think I'll probably enjoy Anna Karenina more because I've seen so many people say, oh, Anna Karenina, I didn't like it because it's about aristocracy and their lives and blah. Well, those are the bits that I'm enjoying in War and Peace. So I do think bring on Anna Karenina, because I think I'll really enjoy that after reading War and Peace. I'm glad I've started it. I'm glad I'm reading it. I will finish it at some point this year, but there is a lot to consider before you pick it up if you are not fully invested in it, because it's a lot. Right, I'm going to do a separate section now on my annotations and how I've annotated and the codes I've used and how I do it, because some people might be interested in that. So here's just a quick section on how I annotate War and Peace, anyone who's interested in that. Annotation is a very personal choice and experience. Some people find it just an enjoyable thing to do while they read. Some people find it helps them read with more intention. Some people do it to help remember certain parts. And I do it for a sort of combination of all of those different reasons. This is the second book that I've annotated in the last year since I started annotating. So the first one was Mansfield Park, and I'll put a link to the video that I did on that, which has a very brief section on annotation in there. But the way I've chosen to annotate, and as I've been annotating, it's kind of developed to become a much more useful process. So I started off by doing certain things that I thought might be useful, and they've been changed and adapted as I've gone on. So first thing, a bit about what I use for annotating. I colour code my annotations, so I wanted different coloured pens. I find that the most useful way to annotate for me, because at a glance when I look through my notes and my underlining, I can look for particular things that are colour coded. So I find that really visual, really helpful, and I didn't want to have lots of different pens to do that with, so I got myself a 4 colour changing pen, and I've got tabs which relate to those colours. So I've got pink and blue and purple and green, and the tabs relate to those colours. The orange tabs I used for sectioning, which is really, psychologically it helps to section off a book of this size. And back in the beginning of the read along, I was sectioning my daily reading. And they come on these plastic cards, which means that I can use this for my bookmark. So it's always in the book, always here. The larger tabs, these ones here, which look like this, I used initially to tab off sections of the book. There's a whole section on characters in here. There are the notes, which are here, and I use the larger, I keep this in the book as well, and I keep this usually within the notes section, relevant to the pace I am in the book, so the notes that go with that particular section, so I can flip to them easily. So I use that as another bookmark. But I also use this for, as well as sectioning, in the beginning I used it to section off the weeks of the read along. So you can see here it would say, week 1, week 2, etc. But as that dropped off, I've now just sectioned off the volumes, so I can see where the different volumes start and end. And also occasionally I'll use them to highlight a particularly interesting parts or particularly interesting bit of the book, and I do recommend getting different coloured pens and using different colours for highlighting, because it means that you don't have to always scribble a note by an underlining. You can underline it, and the colour coding, because you've colour coded it, why you've underlined that passage without having to write things down. So we've got some symbols I use as well. If there's any vocabulary I wanted to look up that I wasn't sure of, I would circle it like this. Blue is for character, so character introductions, I put a box around the character's name, and it means I can quickly see when a character was introduced and who they were. So anything to do with characters, descriptions of them, relationships with other characters. I initially started off with purple for themes, and as the themes start to emerge, I wrote them on here, I add to them as they go along, and then I put some initials next to them, so that because there are so many themes emerging as the book goes on, I started then initialing next to the underlining, whether it was class or something to do with life and death or money and influence, etc. So that kind of thing. The green I haven't used very much, but anything that was really significant in the plot is green, and I put a star beside it if I think it's super significant or important, and also underline any historical details or anything where it was Tolstoy's own voice coming through. So I thought that sort of green, anything historical plot-wise, significant plot points, or anything where it's Tolstoy speaking and giving his opinion. And then pink was just great lines with a little heart there for anything that I found particularly wonderful. Enjoyable sections, great lines. And then I kind of timed myself a little while ago, which is why I realised I was being so slow with reading, and I wrote a little note. One page with no underlining of War and Peace is taking me 1 minute 30 seconds to read. I'm usually a faster reader than that, but I'm reading every single word of War and Peace, and that is just, I did it several times. I read one page, several different, like a whole page, several sections over, and timed them, and the average was 1 minute 30 seconds, and that was with no underlining. And then I figured out how long it would take me to read the rest of the book, and I was like, right, I need to cut back on my annotation because I'll be here forever. So just to show you a little bit of some of it. So in the beginning you'll see a lot of blue because obviously all these character introductions, and you'll see where I've put boxes around the people that are introduced. Sometimes I'll start off underlining a section and then underlining some lines, and then realise that actually I want the whole section, so I just box out the whole section. And this is when I first sort of noticed everyone has an ulterior motive is what I've put here. I've put a star beside that because I thought this is an important theme, and that was one of the first things I looked for. When families were introduced, I started doing a little brief family tree for myself so I could see I could have that to refer to. I didn't want to refer to the character list at the back, as I've said before, because I had a quick glance at it and I saw a marriage between two characters, which I'm sure was a spoiler. So I was like, no, I'm not going to refer to that. And then I made little notes where a character was referred to, and I was wondering who are they in relation to. So I would write the note on here, that's Andre's wife, for instance. Again, another family's introduced, and I'm just writing down notes on who they are. There are some questions here. Will this be a significant relationship, I'm wondering. There's a whole page marked off here. I don't want to show you all of it because it would be probably quite boring for people, but then you'll notice that I've got, so pink here means that I found this whole section really enjoyable to read, or yeah, pink is the enjoyable sections, or the ones that I think are particularly well written or enjoyable to read. And here we've got where I've started labelling my themes. So here we've got influence, so I can see at a glance quickly this is all to do with influence. I can see it very quickly, and I don't need to make huge notes, and that's why the colour coding for me and the labelling like this, referring back to the key, really quicker than writing tons and tons of notes. And then I write down just my thoughts and reactions. I feel a sense of impending doom for the Russian army. Was this a battle that they lost, for instance? So there's a question there because that's in green. And if you remember back from my key, green's historical events. So it's referred to here. And then let me just have a little look. Occasional little notes to remind myself of who is what. Sometimes I'll put an exclamation mark because it's something that's really surprising or shocking. Yeah, so that's how I annotate. I think other people do it differently. You'll see sections where I haven't annotated, and that's because I listened to those sections. So the whole thing isn't necessarily annotated, but where I was reading physically, I did annotate. And again, you'll see, look, the life and death, marriage, class, that's what those things stand for. Yeah, and for example, when I was talking about mental health and the way it's presented in this book, you'll see down here there's a quote which I felt is exactly what rumination and anxiety feels like, because of someone who has suffered with anxiety. I recognise in this description how that feels. So As you go on, you'll see I have sort of less and less in some areas, and then occasionally something will come up where I feel like I really want to make notes on that. One last thing I do want to talk about though is the tabs and the length of them sticking out. If you notice, I've made it, when I tab something, I was tabbing, putting the tab right next to, initially when I first annotated the first book I annotated, putting the tab right next to the area, so I'd have the pointer pointing to this part and the tab would be sticking out about here. Aesthetically, that really irritated me. I found that I'm someone who likes things to be quite uniform in size and you know, and heights, like my bookshelves, etc. So that really irritated me, and also picking up the book and holding it didn't feel that pleasant. But so I always, if you notice, my tabs always go in at roughly in the same place so that they stick up in a minuscule amount as possible. I want to see them, but I don't want to be irritated by them being messy. I want them to be neat. You know, I find it actually really quite beautiful to look at and quite satisfying actually to have a look back at all of the annotations and things. I annotate and underline freehand, which some people might not like, so because it can look quite messy, but then on some sections I will use this as a ruler, because you can, because I've started wanting to be a bit neater. So I don't always do that, but occasionally, yeah, I'll use this to make my underlining a bit neater. Right, so that's my annotation process. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments. So that was a really, really long video, and if you like this video, if you want to see more from me, if you've not been here before, maybe consider subscribing. I'd love to hear from you in the comments as well. Have you read War and Peace? Are you considering reading War and Peace? Has this video been helpful in any way? If you've not been here before, consider subscribing, and hopefully I will see you again here soon. Bye.